Alright, so this will be part 3 of the videos. This is more cam phaser install and timing the engine. I don't recommend trying this if you haven't timed a Coyote before, or if you don't have the instruction manual. This thing's 51 pages long. I happen to work for Ford, so I was able to print it off. I don't know if this is a public document. If so, I'll look for it and put the hyperlink down into like I guess in the description of the video, because you know there's some pretty important stuff in here, especially when you're trying to time a 4-cam engine. You got a lot more timing marks than say just a single cam engine. But we'll go ahead and get into it. This is a cam phaser install as well as timing the engine. So the first thing to go in is the oil pump. I'm using MMR Billet oil pump. I've been using those for a while. Definitely recommend upgrading your oil pump gears from the stock ones. And also use an MMR crank sprocket. So when there's 2 flats on the oil pump, you got to just get them lined up with the flats on the crank. It'll slip right on. Then it's 4 or 5 bolts. Just get those tightened up. Those bolts go in certain locations as well. Once you get them in there, just torque them up, torque them to spec. Next, we'll be sliding on the phasers onto the camshafts. You'll see it a little better when I do the other bank. I was kind of standing in front of the camera, but you'll slide them on there. They only kind of go on one way, and then you'll have to use like a crescent wrench on the camshaft to sort of rotate it around a little bit to get it to seat properly into the phaser. And just run the bolts in. I use an impact gun. Don't hammer it down. And just torque it all into place. Again, use a crescent wrench to hold it in place so you can get those good and tight. After this, we'll be installing the primary chain. Goes from obviously the crank sprocket to the phaser sprocket, and you got little links on that are different colors on the chains. You have timing marks on the crank sprocket, timing marks on the phaser. So just make sure all that's lined up and keep an eye on all that throughout the entire process, because things can move around, it can jump teeth. Right now I'm installing the lower fixed timing chain guide. I'm using the Billet MMR ones. You have to use a little rubber mallet to kind of get it flush in there. This one's fixed at both ends. It doesn't pivot, does not have the tensioner on it. And then just run the hardware back in there, torque that to spec. Next we'll be going in the upper timing chain guide. This one does pivot. Keep an eye on those teeth. Make sure that they're lined up with the sprockets. Right here I'm using the old crank pulley just to rotate it around, just to get my chain where it needs to be, taking some of the slack out of it. So here now I'm putting on the upper chain guide. Just slips right on there. And be installing the tensioner. If you're using new tensioners that'll already be collapsed with a pin in it, leave that in, leave it collapsed. Run the bolts in, and the last thing you're going to do is pull that pin. If you're reusing your old ones, you'll have to collapse those down, then use like some wire. Allen wrenches work. I've even heard small gauge TIG wire will keep that down. And again, once you have the bolts in, you can pull the pin and torque it all into place. Moving on to the other side, so we can see a little better. The phasers just slip right onto the ends of the camshaft. They only go on kind of one way. And you'll have to use, again, a crescent wrench to sort of rotate the camshaft around to get those fully seated. It's kind of a little struggle. You don't really want to go on there too easy. Just a little wiggling, and finally seats itself. And just make sure that your secondary chain up there didn't skip a tooth. It's still lining up with all the marks. So here's going on the second primary chain. Again, there's marked links on it. There's markings on the phasers. There's markings on the crank gear. Just double check that. Keep all that stuff. Make sure it's always where it should be. I'm running this bolt in just because I need to turn the crank. It's a little tough once you get all the chains on, because now you're trying to overcome spring pressure. So I'm kind of using a double nut on the original crank bolt there, just to turn the engine over a little, get some of the chain slack out of it so I can get the guides on, and also to make sure the chains, the colored link is lining up with the mark on the sprocket. That is an MMR billet crank gear. I don't recommend using the original stuff if you're getting into high horsepower or boosted applications. So now this is the upper chain guide on this side is fixed, so it just slips onto the two posts there. You have to kind of run it in with a rubber mallet. Don't hit it too hard, don't bend nothing. Turn it over, kind of bring the slack out of the one side, making sure the link stays where it should. As you can see, I already put my long tube headers on as well. This motor is going to be kind of going in the motor, trans, headers. It's the easiest way into a Fox body. So when you get that chain guide tightened up, torque to spec, always torque everything. And then the bottom chain guide on this side is the one that pivots, and the tensioner will control to take any slack out of the chain. So here I'm just moving that chain, making sure the link is where it should be. Seemed like every time I let it drop down, it wanted to move a tooth on me. And just to let you know, so in my experience in diagnosing a lot of these vehicles is, if you're off a tooth, it's usually equivalent to about 2 degrees of timing. And since this is a twin independent variable cam timing engine, if you're off a tooth, that's like off 2 degrees on one camshaft, you get rolling idles, rough idles, you can get misfire issues. So one tooth can add up. So I got the lower chain guide on there, just running the bolts in for the tensioner. Again, leaving the pin in. I'm using new tensioners. I went with the upgraded Boss 302 ones. And then once you get it tightened up, then you can pull the pin out. And that will allow the plunger inside. You see it popped up, takes all the chain tension off. So I hope that gave some insight into how to time a Coyote engine. It's pretty in-depth with it being a 4-cam engine, but stay tuned for more videos, and subscribe, like, comment, and be glad to answer any questions.